If you'll indulge me for a few moments, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was very young, my father taught me how to play chess. He presented it to me in the same way that most fathers do to their sons, I imagine. He said that he was going to teach me a new game. He was quite patient with me as I worked to understand it. Patience was always one of his greatest strengths. He was a clockmaker, you see, and patience is much more than a virtue in that profession. It wasn't until I was older that I learned that chess wasn't truly just a game to my father. While he made sure that it remained fun when he played against me, that was not the case when he played against others. He approached it with the seriousness that only a driven person can. The joy that I was so familiar with would never return to his eyes until the match was finished. When he played against the other residents of our small town, my father never lost. Obviously, I didn't know it at the time, but today I can safely say that he could have easily obtained the rank of Grand Master if that path had been available to him. That isn't the pride of a son talking. He really was that incredible of a player. You see, the reason that he played with such skill was because chess wasn't a game to him. It was a means to an end. Again, I didn't know that at the time. He kept that from me during my formative years. I didn't find out what drove his need to be the best until the summer of my 16th birthday. On a very hot and very dry July day, a strange man came to our town. Although it was easily 100 degrees and the nearest city was many miles away, he walked into town wearing a wool suit and hat. There didn't seem to be a bead of sweat anywhere on his face, and he was in a pleasant mood as he strolled down the dusty street. My father and I happened to be running an errand when the man put in his appearance. I remember staring at him and wondering why such a person would come to visit our little town. He seemed completely out of place. Truth be told, I believe that I would have found him to be out of place anywhere he happened to be. The man went into the town's only tavern, and I would have likely forgotten all about him if it hadn't been for my father's reaction. He had gone pale, and he stared after the man long after the tavern door had closed. I asked him what was wrong, but he ignored me. It was a long time before he set his jaw and led me home. When we reached the porch of our house, he immediately went inside and retrieved the long wooden box that contained his chess set. This wasn't the set that he had taught me how to play on. That was a simple set that he had purchased from a traveling peddler. The chess set that my father brought back outside was the one that he himself had crafted. He had carved every piece by hand until they met his incredibly lofty standards, and he had spent weeks shaping and sanding the board. He rarely played with this particular set. At the time, I didn't have the faintest idea what was happening. It took years for me to understand why he had hurried home to gather his personal chess set. The reason he had returned to the house was to retrieve his personal weapon of war. With the wooden box under his arm, he led the way back into town. It wasn't a short walk, and by the time we returned, the sun was beginning to set in the distance. My father hadn't said a single word since he had first caught a glimpse of the stranger. Without even a brief pause, he walked directly into the tavern. Feeling a large number of feelings that I wasn't prepared to put names to, I followed closely at his heels. I had never been inside this particular business before. My eyes struggled to adjust in the dim light as the scent of stale alcohol assaulted my nose. Sitting at the table in the furthest corner from the door, a bottle of wine and a nearly empty glass in front of him, was the odd stranger. Ignoring the pleasant greeting from the barkeep, my father went right over to the table and sat down across from the man. I reluctantly followed, but did not sit down in the remaining chair. Now that I was closer, I was able to get a better look at the stranger. His face was round, and the skin not covered by his thick and ragged beard was pockmarked. The hair on his head was thin, exposing much of the scalp underneath. When he smiled at my father, I saw that a number of his teeth were black. He didn't seem surprised in the slightest to see my father, nor did he have any reaction to the wooden case being opened or the chess set being placed in front of him. He simply stared ahead at my father with an unsettling grin. Once the final piece was put in its place on the board, the man finally spoke, asking what the stakes of the game were to be. "I wish for you to return my wife and my son's mother to us," my father stated immediately. I had no idea what to think about his request. My mother had died when I was only months old from a disease that had swept through the town and claimed many of the residents. I had been far too young to remember her. All that I knew about her came from the stories that my father had told me. Each one of those stories had come with a haunted look and a note of sadness. The stranger considered the request for a few moments before nodding. In a quiet, gravelly voice, he stated that should he win, my father's life and soul would be forfeit. Without hesitation, my father agreed. I don't remember the words that I said, but I do know that I objected. My father turned in his seat and sternly told me to be silent. He knew what he was doing, and it wasn't my place to question his judgment. I ceased my objections immediately. I had been raised to follow my father's commands. The match lasted for hours. I spent the time in silence, observing the changing board and working my way through why each player was making the moves that he was. While my father had taught me the various ways the pieces moved and some very general strategy, that game was where my real education began. My father played the game of his life that night. Every move he made was crafted to set up the next 5, 10, 20 moves. He used every trap that he could come up with, some of which I've never seen used by anyone else to this day. I truly believe that, for that one match, he was the greatest player that had ever lived. After the 4-hour mark, however, I came to realize that all that talent and creativity was in vain. Although there were several points when my father appeared to be on the verge of taking control, it was all smoke and mirrors on the part of the stranger. The odd man had been dictating everything about the game since the very beginning. I recognized this before my father did. I know this because, when he finally understood what was happening, I saw the blood drain from his face. The stranger was toying with him. He had lost the moment he had pushed the first pawn forward. My father kept playing. What else could he do? Conceding would mean death. Worse than death, in fact. The ending of a person's life is one thing. The loss of a person's soul is quite another. The game continued for 2 hours longer. While my father continued to look for a way out, either a win or a draw, I put the time to good use. I observed the stranger closely, mentally deconstructing every decision he made, while also making note of even the smallest of movements and facial expressions. It wasn't long before I was able to start predicting what he would do next. To this day, I'm not as skilled at the game of chess as my father was. I'm certainly not as skilled as the stranger he was playing against. When you consider that I'm far better of a player now than I was the evening that this story takes place, it's easy to see how futile it would have been to even consider sitting across that chessboard in my father's seat when the inevitable happened. And yet, I was not only just considering it, I knew that I was going to do so. Eventually, the stranger bored of the game, and with a short flurry of aggressive moves, my father was put into checkmate. He was a proud man, and he refused to show the fear that he had to be feeling. Standing up from his chair, he thanked the stranger for the game, and asked only that he be allowed to have one final drink and a moment to say goodbye to me. The stranger obliged, ordering a bottle of the tavern's best wine and pouring a glass for both my father and himself. As they drank together, much the way that two old friends would, my father told the stranger that he had seen the man once before, back when he was just a bit older than I was. He had witnessed an elderly woman making a bargain with him that involved a simple coin flip. When she had managed to win that flip, a miracle had happened, and her body had been restored to that of a girl on the cusp of womanhood. That, my father said, was why he had challenged the stranger to the game. He knew that the man had the power to grant his request to bring my mother back from the dead, but he had been unwilling to risk such a thing on a 50-50 chance. He had figured that he could leverage his skill at chess to receive his own miracle. The stranger smiled at this. Pouring himself another glass of wine, he told my father that he had walked the earth for a long, long time, and during that time he had amassed a wealth of knowledge, more than any library could ever hope to contain. He had studied everything from science to philosophy to mathematics, even delving deeply into dark and forbidden teachings. One of the constants during all of that time had been chess. The stranger had been playing for over 1,000 years. During that time, he had seen every move, every strategy that had ever been implemented. No matter how talented my father was, and he conceded that my father was one of the best he had ever seen, there was no hope of overcoming that gap in experience. The old woman with the coin had actually had much better odds of surviving her deal. My father laughed at this. I've thought about that moment many times since then, and I've come to the determination that he couldn't have done anything else at that exact moment. It was morbidly amusing. His own intellect and skill had ended up being his downfall. My father finished his drink and waved me over to stand next to him. Normally he wasn't an affectionate man, not in the ways that the term evokes thoughts of, but now he placed his hand on my shoulder and told me that he loved me. He told me that he was sorry that he had struck the deal that was now leaving me an orphan, but that he hoped someday that I would understand why he had made it. I was surprised to see him shed a tear as he said that his only regret was that he wouldn't be alive to see the man that he knew I would become. Telling me to turn around so that I wouldn't see what was coming, he returned his attention to the stranger and said that he was ready. For what I believed to be the first time, I disobeyed him and bore witness to the life instantly draining from him and his body falling lifelessly to the tavern floor. The stranger whistled to himself as he paid no attention to the corpse across the table from him. Instead, he simply stood up, placed money on the table to pay for the wine, and put on his coat as he prepared to leave. I knew that it was now or never. Stepping over my father's body, I told the man that I wished to play against him in a game of chess just as my father had done. He watched me silently for a long moment, amusement dancing in his eyes as he sized me up. Finally, he asked me if I was prepared to wager my life and soul just as my father had. Without hesitation, I told him that I was. When he asked what I wished to have if I won, I had the answer at the ready. I want to know everything that you know, I told him firmly. That seemed to catch him off guard. I'm sure that he had been expecting me to wish for my father returned to life, or maybe my mother. He tilted his head slightly as his eyes narrowed. Eventually, however, he agreed to the terms. I informed him that I would need the day to prepare and that he was welcome to meet me at my home when the sun set. This was also agreed to. With the deal struck, I hurried back to the house that I now owned. He likely believed that I was a poor son because I left his body in the tavern for the authorities to deal with. Perhaps I was. I loved my father, and under normal circumstances I would have made laying him to rest my main priority. I convinced myself that the best way to honor him would be to humble the person that had taken his life. Instead of immediately going inside, I went around to the backyard and to the large shed that my father used as his workshop. Sitting on the workbench, a thin cloth placed over it to keep dust from collecting on it, was a small chess clock made of wood and brass. The detailed woodwork wasn't yet completed, but the clock itself was in working order. I collected it and went into the house. I spent the next few hours tidying up the front room and setting up the chessboard that I had been taught to play on. I moved all of the furniture out of the way so the round table was the only thing in the center of the room. When I had finished, I placed the chess clock down carefully next to the board. By the time the knock I was expecting came at the door, I had changed into my formal clothing, eaten a small bit of supper, and had a bottle of my father's best wine uncorked and ready to pour. I opened the door for the stranger. He had the same wide grin on his face that he had earlier in the day. He greeted me politely and accepted my invitation to sit down at the table. Picking up the wine bottle, he examined the label for a moment before pouring us each a glass. He had no argument when I told him that I preferred to use a chess clock rather than have untimed turns. The stranger did, however, raise an eyebrow when I informed him that I only had placed a single minute on each side. If a player's time ran out or that player was placed in checkmate, he would lose and the other person would claim his reward. With what could only be described as uncertainty, the man agreed on the condition that I go first. I nodded once and started my clock, quickly moving a pawn forward before pressing the switch in the clock to pass the turn. As the stranger began to make his move, I reached under the table and snapped a small piece of twine that I had tied there as I had been making preparations. A heavy object dropped onto my hand, and I felt the cool touch of metal against my skin. Pulling the single-shot pistol out from under the table, I pointed directly at the man's face as his hand froze with the pawn between his fingers. When the shock of what had happened wore off, the stranger's face contorted in anger. He yelled that I had no right to threaten him like this, and he demanded that I toss the weapon away so that we can continue our game as two men would. I didn't say anything as I kept the pistol right where it was and stared back at him. This part had been a gamble. There's no way to know for sure that the weapon could harm the stranger. His reaction was all the confirmation that I needed, though. My silence enraged him further. He listed off a number of things he was going to do to me that were quite unpleasant, and I learned quite a few new terms during his tirade. The veins on his neck stood out prominently as he screamed, spittle flying through the air. This was obviously a man used to getting what he wanted, and being the one that made the threats. As he was taking a deep breath in preparation to launch into more shouting, the chest clock dinged as his time ran out. I placed the gun down on the table and crossed my hands over it. The stranger's eyes bulged as he realized what I had done. He collapsed down into his chair and stared at me for a long moment, completely dumbfounded. I could see it all over his face and demeanor. He had failed to set any kind of parameters for our match due to his own arrogance, and that had led to his defeat. I have to admit that I felt satisfaction as I watched him come to grips with that realization. The smile eventually returned to the stranger's face as he conceded defeat. He told me that it had been hundreds of years since he had been outsmarted, and bowed slightly as he congratulated me. Reaching out his right hand, he told me that a deal was a deal, and he would now pass on to me everything that he knew. I'm not even going to attempt to describe the feeling of having centuries of knowledge shoved into your mind all at once. A lesser man would have been driven insane by the experience, and I sometimes wonder if the stranger intended that to be my fate. I endured, however, and within the space of 10 minutes I had my prize. It would be years until I was able to fully process all of it and put it all together in a way that was truly useful, but I had the information that I had sought. Once the exchange was complete, the stranger nodded once and told me that he would be on his way. As he stood up from his chair, I once again raised the pistol, and this time I pulled the trigger. The shot went right through the center of his forehead, and he slumped back down into the chair, dead. He had, after all, killed my father, and now that debt was paid. I'm telling you all of this because I feel like you need a reminder as to how I approach my affairs. I'm not just a master at the game itself. I play angles that don't even exist in the game, and I always come out the winner in the end. There is a reason why so many people in need come to Silas Pembrook, why you yourself came to me. So yes, Mr. Lewis, I am sure that we're approaching the endgame. I am sure that things are falling into place. I believe that you're reading the signs correctly, and the last piece you need to finally bring this old vendetta of yours to a close can be found in Broken Bend. So now then, shall we get started?